everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Do Good to Lead Well webinar and podcast series. I'm your host, Craig Dowden. It's an absolute pleasure to have you join us today. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time. I've had amazing discussions lately and can't wait for us to dig into the discussion today with our guest, Matt Abrahams. Before we start, I love to provide a little bit of insight into the origin story of the Do Good to Lead Well universe. This started in advance of the publication of my first book, Do Good to Lead Well, The Science and Practice of Positive Leadership. And one of the things that I love most and I'm most grateful for in terms of my career and my professional opportunities is I have the opportunity to engage in phenomenally thought-provoking conversations like today. And what I wanted to do was extend that conversation to a wider community. And this really amplified at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so over the last, now we're almost approaching 2-year anniversary of the podcast, we're approaching almost 100 CEOs, best-selling authors, TED speakers that come to this program. And because of your ongoing support, your social shares, your likes, your comments, your feedback, we have been rated the top 0.5% in the top 0.5% of podcasts globally, according to Listen Notes. So a very warm and heartfelt thank you to all of you who have been a part of this journey. And the primary reason why this podcast has grown, it's listened to in over 106 countries globally, is because of the amazing guests that we have and the extraordinarily interesting, practical, relevant topics that they share with us. And today is no exception. I've been very privileged to know Matt Abrahams for a little while now and had conversations offline. He is a best-selling author and Stanford professor of Think Faster, Talk Smarter, How to Speak Successfully When You're Put on the Spot. So much amazing insights. You can see it over my shoulder. And anybody, I should have put in a poll that said, tell me a page between 0 and 175 for me to access. And you'll see highlights, notes. It's just jam-packed with fantastically powerful and practical tips, tools, and techniques. Matt is a leading expert in communication with decades of experience as an educator, author, podcast host, and coach. As a lecturer in organizational behavior at Stanford University Graduate School of Business, he teaches popular classes in strategic communication and effective virtual presenting. So again, hot topics for sure. He received Stanford GSB's Alumni Teaching Award in recognition of his teaching students around the world. He's also a highly sought after keynote speaker and communication consultant. His online talks garner millions of views. And right after this podcast, go online, check him out. YouTube, Harvard Business have done just phenomenal videos. And he hosts the popular award-winning podcast, Think Fast, Talk Smart, which I have checked out. He attracts some phenomenal guests and have amazing conversations. So, and that's just a snippet of his bio. So Matt, a very warm welcome to the Do Good to Lead Well universe.
Craig, it is a thrill to be with you and congratulations on all of your success. I am a listener of your podcast and have learned a lot and it's awesome to just be with you today.
Well, and thank you kindly. And I just feel I have the profound privilege of hosting it and bringing people on. I learned so much and I share your enthusiasm. One of the things I love about your fantastic podcast is your energy, your insight, and how you engage with guests on really timely topics. And I'm thrilled to flip the camera now for you so that you can talk about your outstanding best-selling book, Think Faster, Talk Smarter. And again, for those of you joining live, this is one of the perks of being in the live audience. You have the chance to talk and ask questions to one of the world's top thought leaders in communication. So please take advantage of that. To begin, I'd love to talk about what piqued your interest in terms of writing this book. What was the motivation behind writing Think Faster, Talk Smarter?
Well, you know, Craig, communication is something I've dedicated my life to. It's something I'm passionate about, and it And I came to realize through a confluence of different channels that the speaking in the moment, that is when you're put on the spot to answer a question, to give feedback, to make small talk, that this is really challenging. And it is the most frequent type of communication that we do. And yet we often don't get any instruction in it. If we learn anything about communication, it is for planned presenting, a presentation, a pitch, a meeting with an agenda. Yet most of our personal and professional communication happens in the moment. Now, at the same time I was beginning to think about this, the deans at Stanford's Business School came to me and said, we have a very specific problem. Our students, some of the best and brightest young business minds in the world, are struggling to answer that dreaded cold call. You remember, Craig, back in school where the professor would say, what do you think? And you had to answer. And our students who knew the answer were not able to answer articulately, were very uncomfortable with it. So they asked me if there was anything I could do to help. So these two different approaches, my personal experience realizing the need for this, and then the deans asking me, led for me to do a deep dive many years ago into what can we do to help people feel better. And I looked at research in psychology, anthropology, neuroscience, even improvisation. And as a result, came up with the methodology that's in the book, and it's in what I teach and coach.
Well, and thank you for that. And I love the approach. I love the evidence-based approach. For those who follow the podcast, know I'm a huge advocate of science and practice. So let's learn from what's being done in amazing studies around the world and reference that. And I just love your point that you raised, because I think it's so important for all of us listening, watching, and listening to this conversation today, Matt, is that where you talk about, well, we can just kind of assume that we're good communicators because we're communicating all the time, and we haven't really thought about, well, what have I been taught, or what role models are there? And I love how the book deconstructs that for us in a very thoughtful way, where you go, huh, okay, that's really interesting. Oh, that's fascinating. And I have to say, and this is going to be my first question, digging in a little deeper, is I sense there's this really purposeful progression within the book. And you start with taming the anxiety beast, which I think is brilliant. And you can kind of, sometimes we can jump over that and get into, okay, the tactics. So, and in the conversations that I have, people will share with me all the time, hey, I'm feeling a little anxious, I'm a little nervous, whatever the communication they're about to take part in. So can you unpack that for us, the anxiety beast, and how we can get better at taming that?
Yeah, so starting with anxiety makes a lot of sense because most people feel nervous in their communication. And we have some evidence that says upwards of 85% of people feel nervous in high stakes, spontaneous, and planned speaking situations. So we need to address it, and we need to address it up front. When it comes to anxiety, those of us who study this believe that it's ingrained in us, part of being human. So we have to find ways to manage it. And there are really two approaches, symptomatic approaches and looking at the sources. So by looking at symptoms and sources, we can become more comfortable. Many of us in these speaking situations, spontaneous or planned, feel as if we're under threat, and our bodies activate the fight or flight response. Our hearts beat faster, our breathing becomes shallow, we get shaky, dry mouth, sweating, turning red. These are all normal and natural responses to threat. So there's some things we can do to manage those symptoms, which help us appear less nervous and actually feel less nervous. So let me just give you two or three to give some insight. Deep breathing is by far the best and most reliable source of managing anxiety. Not every technique works for every person, but deep breathing works for most. And when you take deep breaths, you really want to fill your lower abdomen. It's like you're doing yoga or Tai Chi. And the key is the exhalation. All of the magic for the relaxation response happens during the exhale. So you want your exhale to be twice as long as your inhale. I like to say the rule of thumb is multiply your exhale by 2. Next, for those of us who get shaky, that's adrenaline. Adrenaline's purpose is to move us from threat to safety. So doing purposeful movement, big gestures, if you're standing in front of people, walking forward as you begin a presentation, all of these are ways to let that adrenaline dissipate and you'll stop shaking. And then if you're like me and you turn red and perspire, that's our core body temperature going up. Holding something cold in the palms of your hand can actually cool you down. The palms of our hand are thermoregulators for our body. I'm sure, Craig, on a cold morning, you've had a warm cup of tea or coffee and holding it has warmed you up. We're doing the same thing in reverse. So these are things we can do to manage sources. There's some things we can do to manage symptoms, and this can help us feel more comfortable and confident in our communication.
Well, and again, and already amazing comments coming in through the chat box, and thank you, Matt, for those great perspectives. And I really appreciate, again, as you go through the book, we approach it through a thoughtful lens around, okay, so what are the symptoms? What are the sources? And
Yes.
now, as opposed to a more macro level, more abstract conversation about communication, we're really digging into it. And it's funny when you shared the one about the sweating and the getting it,
Yeah.
that's me as well.
Yeah.
So I
Hold
love
something
that
cold. I
idea.
swear to you, it works. Every time before I go, I hold something cold, it cools me down, I perspire less, I turn less red.
Brilliant. I love it. So this right away, this is amazing. So thank you. I've got a question already, and not surprised, from Barbara, who asked, one of my biggest challenges is small talk because I
Yeah.
find it sometimes meaningless or really difficult to engage in. So I'd love your take on how to change my view on small talk.
Well, and we need to rebrand small talk because lots of big things can happen in small talk. You know, I challenge everybody listening to think about a friend in your friendship network who you met through small talk. Many of us come to make our acquaintances and our friends through chit chat. We do lots of important work in our small talk. We learn about ourselves, we learn about others, we connect, we can collaborate. Lots of relationships and learnings happen in small talk. We tend to shy away from it because it can be incredibly awkward. So I'd love to share just a few bits of advice on how to manage those awkward situations. The first and best advice I get from a friend and a colleague. Her name is Rachel Greenwald. She's an academic as well as a professional matchmaker. Think about that for a minute. And she says something that I think is really profound. The goal of small talk is to be interested, not interesting. And what
Mm,
that does is it takes a lot of pressure off of us. Many of us go into small talk thinking it's like a tennis match where I have to ace the ball over the net to do well. And in fact, the way to do well is to see it like a game of hacky sack. You remember that game, Craig, the little beanbag ball you toss back and forth? The whole goal of that was to keep it up, and you wanted to send it to the other person so they could kick it back to you and you keep it off the ground. Being interested allows you to do that. You ask questions, you express curiosity, you comment on things in the environment. That's being interested, and that makes small talk easier. Now, the other big challenge is how do we get out of small talk? And Rachel, again, has a wonderful technique. She calls it the white flag. Not surrender, but in auto racing, they will wave the white flag before the last lap, and it signals we're almost done. So when you're in conversation, simply say to your partner, in a few minutes, I'd like to go over there and talk to those people, but I'm really enjoying our conversation. I have one more question for you. So you signal you're going to leave soon, but you come back with interest. You have a conversation about that point or an answer to a question you ask, and then you say, thank you so much. I'm going to head over there. Everybody's expectations are set. People feel comfortable because the person you're talking to can begin to plan what they're going to do. It is so much easier to disengage. I use this technique all the time. It is super helpful. So interested over interesting, wave the white flag, and small talk then becomes less daunting for us.
love it. And again, thank you. Thank you. Great insight. Love the reframing of it. So important. I will try that. And I love what you're talking about in terms of that being interested versus interesting and taking the pressure off. And it's fascinating around the question side because questions for me, really provide an opportunity for
Yeah.
someone else to speak. And
Yeah.
it just gives them lots of space. So I love that. I've got a follow up from Charles, which is great. Any advice around the types of questions to ask in small talk? How do you balance the depth of those questions? Any insights would be awesome.
Yeah, so open questions first and foremost. Open questions are questions that don't just have a yes no answer or a one word answer. So open questions. What makes you think about that? Or how come you have that position? Or tell me more is not a question, but it's a wonderful tool. My mother-in-law had a black belt in small talk. She was amazing. She lived in the Midwest. She would fly out to visit us on the East Coast, and she'd get off the plane with 3 new best friends. And her secret was simply tell me more after somebody said something. It gives them permission. It shows your interest. It builds camaraderie. So lots of good ways to do that. I had the good fortune recently of interviewing journalist Charles Duhigg. He has a book out on communication, and he talks about the types of questions we ask that people who are really, really good at communication ask. And they tend to be progressively deeper questions. Now, they don't have, by deeper, I don't mean like, what's the meaning of life? It's simply you start and then you begin to probe more deeply in a non-prodding or in being an interrogator. You simply ask questions that require a little more depth of thought. Now, the key is, in small talk in particular, you need to respond in kind. So you need to also reveal information about yourself. We have this notion of congruence around self-disclosure. So you can really learn a lot about people by asking open questions, questions that get a little deeper as you go, and you can give extra space by saying, tell me more, and by revealing some information about yourself.
This is fantastic, and I'll read several comments. One saying, "Such a profound insight. How questions give me the space to be in the conversation and take the pressure off. Thank you for sharing that strategy with me." And someone else wrote, "Love the progression from more broad questions to more specific ones, and the power of reciprocity." So again, not surprised. This is
Craig,
great.
can I add something to that, to one comment, because I find it really intriguing and interesting to highlight the notion that questions give me permission to say something. Many of us feel we either aren't, it's not appropriate for us to comment, or we just don't have the right to do so. Asking questions is a great way to get your voice heard without actually asserting a position. So too is paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is an amazing skill. If you're in a group meeting, could be at work, could be a chit chat, small talk situation, simply paraphrasing what you're saying can actually add a tremendous amount of value, gives you the right to add your input if you so choose. And if not, it still has made a contribution. So there are many people I talk to when I talk about this notion of spontaneous speaking who feel for whatever reason that it's either not appropriate for them to speak, or they don't know exactly what to say, and simply asking a question or paraphrasing what you're hearing makes a very important contribution to that conversation. So there are tools you can use to help you feel better in those moments.
Love it. And again, lots of great questions coming in and comments. So this is absolutely fantastic. I've got another one here with this is great. Kevin says, "I already have a hand cramp from writing down all of these. I'm glad it's going to be on audio." Kevin asked, "What about the rise of remote work? How has that impacted our communication habits and styles? And any advice as a leader of my team to mitigate those challenges?"
Yes. So being virtual or having this technology, being hybrid, some in person, some not, has fundamentally changed the way we communicate. These tools allow us many opportunities. So we can talk to more people simultaneously. We have simultaneous channels going at the same time, so I can actually write in the chat at the same time I'm speaking. So there are some advantages to these tools, but it makes it really hard. So let me give you a few bits of advice. First and foremost, if you are hybrid, you have to be very concerned about communication equity. Equity in all senses of the word is important, but if there are 5 of us in the room and 3 of us remote, those folks who are remote can feel left out, and it's very easy to forget them. So they don't have an equitable opportunity to contribute. So you need to be constantly thinking about where are the fewest people and how do I bring them in? So one rule that I like to follow is whenever I run meetings and we're hybrid, I always start with where there are fewest people. So if there are 5 in the room, 3 remote, I will always have the first agenda item come from somebody remote, because it literally reminds us that there are other people. So we have to make sure that we treat people equitably in terms of communication time. You must be more concise when you are virtual. People can be easily distracted. They're on their computers, they're on their phones, lots of distraction. You have to be very clear and concise. Concision is important in all communication, but virtual, it is critical. Similarly, you have to work to be engaging. It's not enough just to broadcast information. You have to tie that information to something that's relevant and salient to people. And you do that by giving examples, telling stories, taking polls. You have to pull people in. Just because you're saying it doesn't mean it's engaging. People can be easily distracted. They can be not fully focused on what you're saying. So engagement becomes critical. So we have to think about equity. We have to make sure that we're concise and clear, and we have to build in engagement into what we're saying.
Love it. And again, so many comments coming in. Thank you. Great ideas, great insights. I have another question. This is funny. You probably saw I have paper here. The audience is just coming in rapid
I
fire.
love it. I love
I
it.
know.
Hey, this is spontaneous.
This is great. Yeah, that's right. We're having a real life example of thinking faster, talk smarter right here on the spot. Let's go. So Dasa said, I love the talk so far. Thank you. I feel like small talk is my strength because it is small, personal, and I don't feel judged. However, large presentations where everyone is looking at me is stressful and scary. And I feel the older I get, the more anxious that I become in front of a large audience. Any thoughts or tips?
Yes, so you're not alone. Many people, as they get older, get more nervous, particularly because in their roles, they have more responsibility. There's more consequence and significance to what they're doing. So it absolutely can feel more intimidating. There's a lot I can say, but the first thing and first and foremost is spend time trying to create your own personal anxiety management plan. The very first book I wrote was called Speaking Up Without Freaking Out. It had 50 techniques based on academic research to help people feel more confident in their speaking. Not all of those 50 techniques work for every person. If you find 3 to 5 in there, I'm happy. Let me share one that I think is going to work specifically because of what that person said. They said they feel really good about small talk. So turn your more formal, larger communication into small talk. Here's what I mean. If you're good at small talk, it typically means you're good at Q&A, you're good at answering. It's a bunch of turn taking, you ask a question, I answer, I ask you a question, you answer. Turn your larger communications into that. Start your presentations by saying, today I have 3 questions I'd like to answer for you. Question number 1 is this. This is simply a reframing. You are actually doing a Q&A with yourself. You're having small talk with yourself. But when you see it that way, all of a sudden, a lot of those fears dissipate because you're doing what you're good at doing. So I work with many, many senior leaders who have found this to be a huge unlock for them. They feel much more comfortable in Q&A. We craft their presentations as self Q&A. It works great. If you're using slides, put the question as the title of the slide, and then all you have to do is answer it. So lots of ways to reduce your anxiety. For this particular situation, I would recommend taking your presentations, turning them into Q&A with yourself, and I bet you're going to feel more comfortable.
Well, and again, thank you. Lots of great comments coming through, Matt. And what I love about that answer as well, it strikes around the strength psychology, right? Like how do you deploy that strength
Yeah,
that you have
absolutely.
elsewhere? Brilliant in terms of how to position that. And I love the reframing perspective. I just think that's so powerful. We've got another question coming in, so it's just great. From Sheila saying, I feel I'm a little quite introverted and even shy. What advice do you have for more introverted, shy people when it comes to communicating?
All right, I'm going to get on my soapbox for just a minute. A lot of people say that a big challenge or that being introverted has a negative perspective when it comes to communicating. In fact, a lot of the skills that are associated with introversion are absolutely helpful and in some cases better than the more extroverted people. Introverts tend to be very thoughtful. They think before they speak. Extroverts tend to speak and then think or try to think while they're speaking. I'm an extreme extrovert, so if I sound offensive, I am being self-deprecating here. And my wife is an extreme introvert, so I see that. So introversion in and of itself is not a negative quality. It is actually very helpful. The thoughtfulness, the high EQ that tends to come with it, being very thoughtful of others, really important. What we have to do if we're introverted is find opportunities and avenues to communicate that are more comfortable for us. Let me give you a few suggestions. Here's where being virtual can help. You can actually type things into the chat to add contribution, which might feel less stressful and less requiring of energy. You can form allyships with people. So perhaps before going into the meeting, I meet with people individually. Many introverts feel more comfortable one-on-one than in a big group. And I talk to people individually. So in the meeting, others can bring forward my point of view, or when I do speak up, I can say in my talking with Craig and Joanne, we discussed. So all of a sudden, I am able to play to my strengths without having to feel drained and having the spotlight on me. And so there are ways to harness the power of introversion through allyship, through using some of these remote technologies, and also following up after meetings. So it's okay after a meeting where you didn't contribute very much to go to people and say, you know, upon reflection, I was thinking this, this, and that. And that's okay. And it's actually, in some cases, desirable. So introversion is not bad. Introverts have to find skills and ways to play to their strengths. And I have seen many introverts communicate incredibly successfully.
Well, again, so many comments coming in. I'm going to read a couple. One saying in particular, thank you, Matt, for reframing how I look at introversion. This is so powerful. And someone else says, which I think is great, I'm so glad we're talking about the power of introverts. Too often we talk about how attractive and desirable extroversion is in organizations and in our communities. Thanks for shining a light on that, Matt. So,
yes.
there you go.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, the extremes are never good, and the reality is, introversion and extroversion. There are qualities of both that are very helpful.
Absolutely.
The problem is extroverts are just loud. So we get a lot of attention just because we talk a lot and we're loud. Doesn't mean what we're always saying is the right thing or the best thing.
Absolutely. And one of the things, and I'm thrilled with these questions, and thank you for your amazing answers, Matt, is that it really fits so nicely with the philosophy within the book and the approach that's taken in the book around being more thoughtful. That's the underlying piece, making informed choices. And then rather than jumping in right away and judging or course correcting, it's like, okay, how do we take things from different elements? And as you were saying, capitalize on the strengths that we have. There are lots of different ways for us to communicate effectively. Let's be aware of those and not just focus on a singular outcome. So this is, again, I love this. And another question from the live audience, one that I was interested in asking as well, in a little different way. Henry asked, what are your thoughts around humor? It seems like, especially today, humor can get us into trouble. I enjoy telling a good joke, and sometimes I hold back in my presentations or in my executive team meetings. Any thoughts around how we navigate this, Matt?
Yes. So let me take a step back and say, I believe the most precious commodity we have in the world today is attention. Getting people's attention and sustaining attention is critical. I define sustained attention as engagement. Humor, among other tools, is a great way to engage. It is also an incredibly risky way to engage because if your joke falls flat, if it's perceived as insulting or insensitive, it can work against you. So I teach my Stanford MBA students and in my consulting and other areas, I talk about other safer engagement techniques, using analogies, using storytelling, asking questions, physical engagement, taking polls, etc. These are ways to engage that tend to be a little safer. Now, that isn't to say that we shouldn't try to be funny. Humor can work really well. I have the great pleasure of working with two colleagues who wrote a book called Humor Seriously. You can listen to them on Think Fast, Talk Smart. It's one of the it is probably the funniest of my podcast episodes. And it is the only business book I've ever read where I've laughed out loud many times. In the book, they help people find their own sense of humor. They argue that everybody can be funny. And they spend time talking about how to thread that needle that Henry is talking about. How can we bring our true self, our sense of humor, to situations without the risk? Now, it's not a surefire way. I mean, there are always things that can go wrong. But what's more important to me is the problem we're trying to solve, which is we're trying to engage and connect. Humor is a great tool for that. There are other tools. Use them judiciously. My advice is simple when it comes to humor. Focus group your jokes if it's a planned presentation. Go to people and say, I'm going to tell this joke. Is it funny? And listen to their response. And then second, if you are going to use humor, use self-deprecating humor. It tends to be safer and can get you to the same place. So I love that you're thinking about engagement. Humor can be risky.
No, and I love that. And again, lots of comments. Thank you. Really insightful. Helps frame this very well for me, Matt. And I'm with you 100% in terms of, once again, can be a fantastic tool. It can be a great way to connect and engage and get people interested in what you have to say. And then it comes with its risk. And I love how you're kind of de-risking the situation in
Yeah.
terms in terms of that space. I've got another question. Again, these are continuing on. This is Adele says, how about cultural differences in communication? What are some tips, tools that we can be aware of when we're looking at communicating across cultures?
Yes. So culture and context absolutely influence communication, and we need to be aware of them. And when I think about culture and context, I think way beyond just country of origin, although that's very important. I have two teenage kids. They have a very different culture and context around communication than I do. Within your organizations, different departments, different divisions have different cultures around their communication. So we need to first and foremost be aware of that. And we need to remind ourselves that no one culture or context is the right way to do it. We just have to be open to alternative ways. And we have to do what in the academic world we call code switching. We have to figure out what are the norms and expectations and how can I choose to adjust if I think that's the appropriate thing to do. So it's about being aware and sensitive. There are some pretty clear distinctions when we talk about cross-cultural communication in terms of country of origin. Different countries or different regions of the world tend to have different views on appropriateness around individuality versus group. And so we call these high context, low context cultures. That is, how much information are they relying on in the context to inform what they're saying versus not. So there's a lot of learning we can do. I have a colleague, her name is Michelle Gelfin. She's been interviewed on my podcast, written a book. She talks about tight versus loose cultures and how some cultures are more tight in terms of the way they view the world and how they see time and use of time, as one example. And that affects communication as well. So there are lots of things we have to be sensitive to. The amount of import of context, the amount of rigidity within the culture. But the bottom line is this. The culture you come from is not necessarily the right culture. It is just a culture. And as our organizations become more global and as they become more interconnected, we need to just be observant and decide how we as a group are going to function and define our own norms, even if there are people in that group from different cultures, again, not just country of origin, age. In the workforce today, we have multiple generations. Each generation has different ways of communicating, and we have to take that into account. So culture and context play a critical role. It's about awareness, it's about being open, and it's about coming up with unified goals and norms as a group about how we're going to communicate.
Well, and again, so many wonderful comments coming through. And Matt, for me, what I love about what you're sharing is really about recognizing my own cultural frame of reference
Yeah.
and acknowledging that it is just that. It's a frame of reference.
Yes.
It's not right. It is a lens through which to look at a particular situation. And again, it's something that struck me through the book, and it's why I loved it. And I was engaged throughout because there's really this philosophy of curiosity about self, curiosity about others, curiosity about situation, and then to your point, and being open around all of the inputs, the stuff that's within us, the some that's without us, to then align so that we can have the impact that we say we want to have in those critical situations. So I just think that's a master class in how we approach work and life. I've got another question. We just keep going here. Deborah says, this is fantastic. One of the best conversations I've been a part of in a while. I'm not sure if you can help me. How can I engage more effectively with someone who I feel is a poor listener?
Yes, well, Deborah, thank you for the compliment. I am thoroughly enjoying the conversation. Craig is a master at what he does. So the key to all communication is making sure that our messages are relevant and salient to the person we're speaking to. And when you have somebody who is not a good listener, first and foremost, I, in my own life, try not to ascribe negative attributes to the person who's a poor listener. There might be many justifiable reasons why the person is not listening well in the moment. And so I try to come from a place of what can I do to engage them more so that they do listen. So how you go about that is really thinking about what's important and relevant for that person in what I'm saying. And sometimes you can speak it, other times you can ask it. You can say, so given what we're talking about on this project, how does that impact what you're doing? Or how might that help you? So by getting the other person to see the relevance and salience of the information, that can be really important. We also have to understand that there are barriers to listening, and sometimes managing through those barriers to listening can help. And the barriers to listening come in 3 P's. They are, first, physical noise. You can be in an environment where it's just loud. And you know, Craig, I think you and I are of a similar vintage. As I get older, it gets louder around me and harder to hear, right? So you might, the biggest thing you might be able to do is just move to a quieter location. That's physical noise. Then there's physiological noise. People could be hungry, they could be tired, they could be nervous. That gets in the way of their ability to listen. So sometimes taking care of those needs first helps. So maybe instead of having that tough feedback conversation before lunch, you do it after lunch and everybody's in a better place. And then finally, the 3rd P is psychological noise. People can be in their heads, evaluating, judging, rehearsing. So you need to pull people forward, help them be more present oriented. So realize there are a lot of reasons people might not listen. And there's some things you can do in terms of your messaging, make it more relevant, but also you can try to address some of these barriers to put somebody in a position where they can better listen. So it's hard, but listening is critical, and we as the speaker can do a lot to help others listen to us.
Well, and I love how you're focusing, once again, reframing that question for us, looking at it in a different lens, and then stepping back and saying, so what can I do to engage more effectively with the other person, as opposed to judging the the audience? Right. And I just got a comment. This is great. Deborah just typed in. She said, that was fantastic. I realize I don't ask enough questions. Brilliant. Right. Yeah, that's so important.
Right. We often go into broadcast mode where we just say lots of things, and we need to be much more receptive and ask questions.
This is great. Well, and thank you. Another question coming in from Pat saying, so I'm in information technology, information security, in my senior executive in my company. And sometimes I struggle with how to bring a complex topic to the rest of the team and shine a light on some challenges. Any advice for how to be able to do that more effectively?
So yes, I have two things come to mind. One is this notion of relevance and salience, help people understand it. One of the big jobs of leaders, I believe, is to help people prioritize and focus. And so framing the issue that you want people to pay attention to is really important. Help them understand it in context, understand it in terms of priority. Here's where analogies can be really helpful. If you can relate it to something they know, that can be very helpful. The second part of that question was about complex issues. I am all about helping people take complex ideas and make them accessible. To me, accessibility is not about dumbing it down or oversimplifying. It's about finding mechanisms to help people understand. So it could be deconstructing the problem into constituent parts so people can understand it better. It could be visually diagramming it so that people see it. It could be backward mapping, start at the desired goal and what are the steps we need to take to get there. There are a whole series of tools that we can use. I wrote an article on this that really looks at how can we make things more accessible without confusing the people or dumbing things down. So to answer the question there, 2 parts. First, you have to help people prioritize and understand through making it salient and relevant. And then 2, leverage some of these accessibility tools so people can really understand what it is you're talking about.
Love it. No, this is so, so important. And got a comment as well saying this is great stuff. Thank you so, so much for sharing. And have another question from Evelyn, who's wondering, what about conflict? I find this is where I really struggle to show up as my best self. And I would love to think faster and talk smarter in conflict.
Yeah. So there's a lot to say about conflict. We have several episodes on my podcast talking about it. First and foremost, conflict is good. Good things can come from conflict. So this notion that we should never have conflict, I think, is a false assumption. Conflict, when managed well, can actually bring great benefits, and it can help people feel as if their voices are heard. To me, conflict is really I like to frame it as a problem to be solved.
Mm,
And in so doing, if you're trying to problem solve, the best way to do it is to collaborate. So I'm trying to find ways to invite the other person to have a dialogue with me. When we come from an entrenched position, saying, I am right, you are wrong, that makes collaboration very difficult. So we want to demonstrate understanding. Understanding and agreement are different. I can understand your point of view and still disagree with you. But when I foster understanding and try to engage for understanding, that invites collaboration and reduces defensiveness. Let me
mm,
give you one of my favorite tricks. I learned this from a friend of mine, and my wife and I do this all the time now. When there is an issue that comes up, it is very easy to assume that the other person who might have a different point of view has as strong a position as you do in this circumstance. So let's take something very simple. Let's say, Craig, you and I want to go out for lunch. We would enjoy being in each other's company, having lunch together, but you want to go out for Mexican and I want to go out for Italian food. Okay, this could be a conflict. But what I recommend, and this is what my wife and I do, is you could say, Matt, I'd really like to go to Mexican food. On a scale of 1 to 10. For me, it's an 8. And I would say, you know what, Craig, I was hoping for Italian, but for me, it's a 3. No conflict, right?
right.
But if I say mine's an 8, yours an 8, then we have to have a different discussion. We often assume that the other person holds their position as strongly as we do, and then we approach it in that way. And so we often create conflict where conflict was not needed. So by simply prioritizing and sharing that prioritization, it helps you understand what level of conflict or communication we have to have. So it's all about trying to solve collaboratively. It's about understanding and signaling understanding, not necessarily agreement. And then finally prioritizing so you understand where to invest your resources and where not to. And this can really help you manage these conflict situations such that you get the benefit of conflict, learning other people's opinions, seeing other points of view, having a devil's advocate. All of that is really useful. We just don't want to have all of the psychological damage that's possible if we handle these things poorly.
Well, and this is great. I have to read this. The mic drop amongst a group of mic drops, prioritizing your position.
I'm
Love,
glad people,
love
it
this.
is fundamentally changed the way my wife and I deal with issues around challenges around conflict. It erases some of them. It's just not a conflict.
Well, and I love once again, and these are things that we don't think about or often don't think about, yet they are ingrained, almost not even assumptions. They're almost like beliefs that these are truisms almost that, oh, well, if I feel X, then the person has the exact same mirror image of X on their side. And it's like, not necessarily. So take in one moment. I love this, how it links back to the book, right? Think faster, talk smarter. Take a second to kind of
Yeah.
go, hey, Matt, how important is this to you right
Right.
now? It changes everything. I love that. I think it's so,
And
so good.
even if I say this, even if you and I are both passionate about our positions, the fact that you asked me shows that you're concerned about me and my position. So it's a win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is just so. I love the comment, the mic drop among mic drops. So there you go. That maybe that'll be the title of this
The
episode.
mic drop of mic drops. I like it. Yes.
That's right. So we've got a question from David saying, Matt, this is amazing. Thank you for sharing your passion and your insights. What are your thoughts around social media and how we engage in the social media universe? And then put in brackets, I won't use a derogatory term to suspend judgment. So,
So I tend to be I tend to be optimistic in general. I look and enjoy new media for communication. You know, I got into podcasting because that was new. We're trying video casting because that's new. So I'm all about trying to help people share their information. I think the more people communicate, the more likely we are to get better results. Social media is a tool. There are a tremendous number of challenges with social media. It doesn't necessarily paint the reality. It can put pressure on people. There's a lot of misinformation. So we have to be very careful. Seeing it as one of many tools to get information across, I think is important. I'm a big user of social media. I use LinkedIn a lot, etc. And yet, it is just one of many tools. I have seen, you know, I have teenagers, I have seen in them, I have seen in their friends, some of the negative consequences in terms of how we perceive ourselves and how it can be an echo chamber of negativity. But I do think it can be a useful tool in moderation, with some appropriate guidelines and rules. Clearly, when talking about children, we have to be very careful and cognizant of what's involved. But I do think it is a valid source of conveying information. How we communicate virtually, or in these social media tools, that is also something we have to think about. We have to be very concise. We have to. Let me share a couple things I think are really cool about social media. One, it has shown the power of visual communication in a way that I don't think we typically have. If you think of Instagram, TikTok, etc., it has forced us to be concise and clear. Twitter, X, whatever it is. I mean, you only had a certain number of letters to say things. So there are benefits that go beyond just the channel of communication that it offers. But like many channels, it can bring a lot of concern. So use it judiciously. If you have kids, if you're a manager or leader, talk about what's appropriate and what the rules are, and help people to use it as a tool, which it is.
And I love that a point that you're making. And again, lots of great comments coming through, Matt, and particularly around it being a tool. And then we have a choice about how we use that tool and how we can use it as a tool for good, or it could be a tool for not so good,
Yeah.
both for the people on the receiving end of whatever we decide to put out there, or for ourselves in terms of how we're engaging in that space. And I love, once again, how that ongoing thoughtfulness about, okay, so what purpose is this tool serving for me right now? What am I trying to achieve? And then what are the potential downside costs on this? Great. Like, again, it's a much more intentional way of being, a much more intentional way of communicating, and impacts us very positively. I've got a follow-up question, probably not surprisingly, about the social media side, because Christine said, I'm glad David asked about social media. I'm curious about emojis. How can we use them effectively, or can we use them effectively?
Yes. So this is really interesting. I have a big smile on my face for that question. Uh, I I have asked every year I've taught at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. I ask my students, and so this is 15 years now, are emojis appropriate in business communication? And I can absolutely tell you that 15 years ago it was no. Why would you even ask that question? That's ridiculous. It is now a little, my students are saying a little more than 50% are saying, yes, emojis are appropriate. They are a tool. Obviously, certain emojis mean certain things. They have cultural context, et cetera, and we have to think about that. But I see them yet again as another channel for communication. And so are they appropriate? As long as there's agreement and people understand that this is something that's appropriate, just like I might have protocols for what I would put in emails or in Slack or in other tools. I think having protocols around using emojis are great. I use emojis in my communication. I find, I don't know if you, Craig, have had this situation, but where you engage in text chats or even emails where they keep going and they feel like they're going longer than they need to. But everybody, it's like back when I was in high school. I never wanted to hang up the phone first when I was talking to that girl I liked. I feel like that happens. And so I just do a thumbs up emoji or a thank you emoji. And that's my way of saying, okay, my part in this conversation is done. I got what I needed. And it would be very hard and probably inappropriate for me to say, okay, I got what I needed. I'm done. Thank you. So I do think emojis can be useful tools, but we have to, again, set expectations and guidelines around them. And for any of us of our vintage, Craig, we have to talk to younger folks to make sure we don't use an inappropriate emoji. There are a lot that I don't know what they mean in the common vernacular. So let's make sure we're not sending inappropriate vegetables and fruit emojis to people.
Exactly. Well, and really appreciate it. And again, comments coming through around like shared understanding, shared agreement around emoji usage. I think this is great. Well, time is flying by. I mean, we're
Yes.
less than 10 minutes. It's incredible. So thank you, Matt. This has just been great. I've got another question from Charles saying, I wonder sometimes how good a listener that I am for others. So,
Mm.
any advice around what great listening looks like and feels like?
Yeah, I love that question. I love the focus on, am I a good listener or not? There are a couple people that I really look to when it comes to conversations or thinking about listening. And there's a lot out there on listening that we can really focus on. Two names come to mind. Julian Treasure's got a lot of TED Talks and books on listening. And Oscar Trimboli has a great podcast that's dedicated just to listening, and I encourage everybody who wants to become better listeners to do it. So a few things that I think signal good listening. One, that people tell you more. The more information somebody gives you based on your responses to them signals that you're doing a good job listening. When somebody isn't listening, we don't want to speak to them, right? We don't share more. So you can observe, are people telling me more? Is the depth of the information there and increasing? And that's something to look for. I think in ourselves, we can be thinking about a couple things. Are we asking questions? Is our talk time more focused on them than us? In conversations, the conversation science, they distinguish between two types of turn taking, support and switching turns. A supportive turn is where I ask a question or follow up in a way that keeps you as the focus. So if Craig said, hey, Matt, I just got back from Costa Rica, I might say, oh, did you visit San Jose? Or tell me something fun that you did, or did you snorkel? Those are all supporting responses. If Craig says, hey, I just got back from Costa Rica, and I said, oh, I just got back from Hawaii, that's a switching response. What conversational science teaches us is good listeners have more supporting responses, but not exclusively supporting responses, because otherwise people feel interrogated and that works against you. So it's about time on task. How much are you listening versus speaking? Are you using more supportive responses than others? Are people saying more and revealing deeper information? All of those are clues and cues that you are a good listener. I just love the fact that you're trying to figure that out, because that means you likely are a good listener. People who are bad listeners, they don't take time to try to figure it out. I have a colleague who jokingly said, listening's that thing I have to do before I get to talk. And that's the
Yeah,
wrong approach to listening.
well, and it's so great. And again, I couldn't agree more in terms of just being thoughtful around that listening approach and how important it is, and just asking that question. So powerful, and lots of great insights again here. I also know that in the book you talk about feedback and how to have feedback conversations. So, and that comes up a lot in terms of, so how can I deliver feedback? How can I receive feedback? Can you share some tips, tools, techniques that we can use? Because feedback is a valuable gift.
Absolutely.
So how
Feedback
can
is
we
critical.
maximize that? Yeah.
Yeah, so I am a big fan of Kim Scott and Radical Candor. Kim is actually a friend and a neighbor. We'll often go walking together, and I really like her approach. Feedback is something that should be constantly given. It's not just in those critical instances where something's gone wrong. If you are giving feedback, positive, neutral, constructive, all the time, any one bit of feedback is seen in the larger context, and people begin to understand that you really care for them. When it comes to feedback, again, much like conflict, it's about inviting the other person to work with you. It's not me coming in and saying, thou shalt do this. It's let's work together. Now, certainly there are some behaviors and things that are absolutely need to be shut down in the moment. It's not about collaboration. It's about you must stop that. But that's not the majority of constructive feedback. I'm going to use this as an opportunity, Craig, to talk about something that I think is critical in all communication, but especially spontaneous speaking, and that is structure. Many of us, when we go to give feedback or answer questions, we ramble. We say more than we need to. We list or itemize everything we're thinking. We take our audience on the journey of our discovery of what we want to say as we're saying it. And that's hard. People can't process lists of information. I think about when I go to the grocery store, if I have to buy more than 3 items, I have to write it down because I can't remember lists. Yet we often list in giving feedback, here are the 5 things I need you to do differently. I can remember maybe 1 or 2 of them. Structure can be very helpful. And the book teaches structure. And in fact, the second part of the book gives different structures for different spontaneous speaking situations. Think of a structure as a recipe. I'm not saying that you say these exact words, but it gives you a step-by-step place to go. After I've cracked the eggs, I then whisk them, right? So it's a series of steps that you can think through, so it helps you prioritize. I have a structure I really like for giving feedback. It's answering 3 questions. What, so what, now what? What is the feedback? So what is why it's important? Now what is what I'd like you to do differently? So Craig, you and I come out of a meeting, you say, Matt, what did you think? How did you think it went? I might say, Craig, I thought the meeting was great, except when you talked about the implementation plan. You talked quickly and didn't give a lot of detail. That's my what. When you speak quickly without a lot of detail, people think you're not as prepared. That's my so what. Next time, I'd like for you to slow down and I'd like for you to add these 2 pieces of evidence. That's the now what. So what, so what, now what? Just answering those questions helps you structure your feedback in a way that is clear, concise, and memorable. So structure is part of the key to speaking spontaneously, and that particular structure, what, so what, now what, is very useful in feedback.
Love it. And again, so many comments coming through, and we're really in the final lap here, which has just been amazing. Several people commented, love this perspective on structure. Yes, I've been in conversations where people go on, and it's tough to follow them.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. And I've got another comment, which I think is great. I've been picking them out. I couldn't read them all. It would take the whole time we're here. There's another fabulous observation, which I would agree. They said, thank you, Matt, for consistently summarizing the key points of your answer in each of the questions for this podcast. It's given me time to both write them down and assimilate and reflect on them. So I love that. We're pretty well right at the end. I can't believe it. I had a list of questions, and the audience and I had the very similar questions. It was just so great. And Matt, thank you for your energy, your enthusiasm, your insights. Was there anything that we didn't cover today about your book, about your amazing consultancy, podcast, other things that you do that you would love to share in a final comment before we close?
Well, first, Craig, thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciated your questions and the questions of the audience. You do great work, and I enjoy learning from you. The last thing I will say is this. Everyone can improve their communication. Many of us feel that we're just not born with the gift of gab, and that's not me. In fact, I have seen it in my own life, in the teaching I do, and the coaching I do. All of us can get better. It takes repetition, reflection, and feedback as the 3 key steps. Listening to podcasts like yours, hopefully listening to podcasts like mine, help people, finding trusted others. I'm a huge fan of Toastmasters and improvisation. There are lots of things we can do to learn and get better at communication. And when we do, we begin to help others by that role modeling we do. So I encourage everybody to work on their communication.
Well, and thank you, Matt. You provided a masterclass in that today. And what I love about your podcast, your work, the book, it's that it's all around how we can be at our best personally and professionally and apply these skills. And I also love that as well. It's all around every single day we have an opportunity to learn and grow. So thank you again for your time. Thank you everyone for joining live today. Can't wait for the release of this episode. And until next time, take care. Bye for now.